The Radio Misfits Podcast Network.
Hi there, and welcome to another episode of Planted with Sara Pion. I'm Sara Pion, your host, and today we have Julia Jacobson, CEO of Aster Farms. As CEO of Aster Farms, Julia brings an expertise in entrepreneurship, supply chain management, and business development to the Aster team. Her personal interest in cannabis is rooted in her battle with chronic migraines, incorporating the plant with her prescribed routine to mitigate symptoms, balance equilibrium, and chart a healthy course. Julia develops Aster's high-level vision, ensuring the team is 2 steps ahead as the company scales. And prior to Aster Farms, Julia was co-founder and CEO of, Julia, you're going to have to, Namarket? In-Market, thank you.
In-Market.
An affiliate marketing platform for content providers. She led the company through Techstars and its acquisition by XO Group in 2016, where she went on to become the Director of National Revenue Products. Julia's career began as a buyer for Bloomingdale's, giving her a solid foundation in retail and supply chain economics. And today, Julia continues to be a mentor to Techstars and young entrepreneurs in many fields. Aster Farms is a sustainably grown cannabis company from Northern California with a deep-rooted belief that responsible farming, live soil, and organic inputs produce the highest quality flowers. That coffee. I need a little more coffee. Aster Farms lets nature do the work because clean cannabis equals a clean high. Clean cannabis for a clean high, bigger than buds. I love that. So I just have to say, Julia, it's just so nice to have you on the show. Welcome. I love the vision your company has.
Thank you so much for having us. We're really excited to chat today.
What I wanted to start out with, we'll definitely talk about sustainable cannabis because that's incredibly important. But first, I wanted to talk about your path to cannabis. I mentioned a little bit in your intro, but really what led you into it, what you're passionate about now, and what paths you see down the line.
Yeah, absolutely. So, my interest in cannabis really shifted in the last few years. I had been a recreational user of cannabis for a while, and I started to develop chronic migraines. My mom has them, they're hereditary, and they really started to get out of control. I was on a cocktail of medications, reaching for anything, like lidocaine shots in my forehead, trying anything. And nothing was working. It was debilitating, and I was in and out of the hospital. And finally, an ER doctor said to me, and this was back in New York, I can't prescribe you cannabis, but I would suggest you try it to treat your migraines. And that was kind of the moment where cannabis completely changed for me, from something that just used to be fun and part of my recreational life to actually something that was healing me and letting me live the life that I want to live and not be sick anymore. And so it really kind of changed the way I thought and felt about the plant. And ever since we've gotten involved in the industry and launched our brand and really started to dig in, every day more and more, I come to respect that part of cannabis and that part of this industry because it really truly is a medicine, whether you're actually prescribed cannabis in a medicinal way or for people who are using it in medicinal ways that are not as, obvious as that, whether it's just to help your mind shut down so you can go to sleep, to calm some anxiety, etc.
Yeah, the interesting thing, too, is when we're looking at the advent of legalization in different states, the one thing that I've noticed is that people really expected that adult use would mean recreational use would go way up. But what I noticed was that it created greater access for people to be able to use cannabis to help alleviate symptoms.
Yeah, that's true. It's what is interesting, at least in California, is that while that is absolutely true, there are people who, just like you're saying, who, don't necessarily get a prescription for sleeping pills, but definitely have used cannabis to assist in their getting a better sleep, who now have access to it. At the same time, at least in California, when recreational came on the market, a lot of the dispensaries really lost the knowledge and the direction to be talking to consumers on a medicinal, more kind of medical basis. So as a real medical patient in California, I have actually found it challenging to get the right information and have the right conversations with bud tenders since it has gone recreational.
Yeah, it's an interesting dilemma because especially when we're looking at actually remaining in compliance, there's a lot of language issues that have now come up through policy. And I think that another thing that's really important is looking at the cultures of the different stores and how they're teaching, their bud tenders or cannabis consultants or, whatever their title is at the dispensaries. Because whether we're calling it recreational or medicinal, it's a substance that creates a reaction in the body. And so it's really important for people to not only feel confident in being educated by people behind the bar, but also in their choices and creating a safe container for experimentation. I was wondering, when you were working with your migraines, what cannabinoids do you find are helpful, and what ways do you like to consume to give you relief?
That is a great question. We're still learning more and more every day, but one cannabinoid that I accidentally came across that helped me is CBG. And so CBG actually can help dilate the blood vessels, particularly around your ocular cavities, so around your eyes. With some migraines, you actually want to constrict the vessels. With other migraines, you want to relieve them. So with certain migraines that I get, I found that strains that are high in CBG have been really helpful to kind of kick it in the butt. I actually have also used CBG tablets from Level. It's a brand that makes minor cannabinoids in tablet form. And so that's also a great way to not necessarily get the THC high, but just get that CBG that I need to shut it down.
Yeah, I think that's one of the things that's really important to note is that you can get relief and still have it be functional. Because I think a lot of people...
Absolutely.
Yeah, a lot of people want to use cannabis, but they're afraid that it's going to take away from their day. But there's so many ways to be able to use it. I remember back in the day when we used to still weigh out flowers, a lot of times people who had migraines would gravitate towards White Widow because it had some really good effects as far as being a bronchio and vasodilator. And I think that it's really fascinating. Yeah, I think that I'm hoping that there's more research that goes into it, especially because, as you know, being growers, it's like the different phenotypes will have different expressions. And so how do we track that?
Exactly. I know I have found that white buffalo, which is a pretty hard strain to find in California these days, because the nursery that used to breed it is no longer breeding it, so it's up to the individual farms to actually carry on the genetics. So we know one farm that's continuing it, but white buffalo has been a really high CBG producer. But it's tricky, it's difficult because, there isn't that much data and that much information, and particularly spread enough through the entire supply chain. So when we're buying our genetics, the nurseries we're buying them from, they're not necessarily focusing on minor cannabinoids. They're telling you the THC. They're telling you what level of hybrid is it. Does it swing more sativa, more indica? They're telling you the crosses. They're telling you, the flowering cycle, how long it'll take to grow. But they're not telling you, this strain has typically tested high in CBG, because they're not looking for that. So, I think right now it's up to the brands. Once we get our testing back, when we're looking for different cannabinoids and products to put in our SKUs, I think right now it's up to us, but I think hopefully in the future that will actually be something that we can drill down to at the nursery, at the seed sale level.
It's interesting that you mentioned that too, because it's like when we're looking at how cannabis works, we really should be doing a broad spectrum approach where we look to see everything that's in there with the terpene count, all the cannabinoids. And then the one thing I wanted to talk to you about was the article that came out the other week about THC levels and how, we have all these high octane THC flowers now. And one of the biggest misconceptions is that that's the indicator of strength or the ultimate feel, because I've had really high THC flowers that have been relatively functional, and I've had things that are around 13% with a really interesting terpene profile that have blown me away. And consumers don't understand that is not the end all be all. And sometimes it actually, they aren't even nearly as great as some of the lower THC percentages, but it seems like a lot of growers are under pressure to grow a lot of high octane THC flowers.
Yeah, when we first came on the market, we launched our brand in the regulated legal market in 2018, and at that time, it was all potency hunting. When you had a meeting with a bud buyer, all they wanted to talk about was your potency, and anything under 20%, they were just not even interested in. And I definitely still think that there's a little bit of that going on. It's one of the few things that bud tenders gravitate towards to talk about. But I also think it's consumer driven because consumers have not been educated. They haven't been given enough information to feel confident walking into the dispensary and saying, I don't care about the THC. I want to understand what is the most complex, profile of a cannabinoid and terpene structure that you have here? Like, what is going to be the best high, or what is going to be the most balanced high? And I think you get that from that full structure, which is really, one of the unique things that we find is beneficial about growing outdoors. Typically, if you look on the market, if you go to a dispensary and you look on the menu, and this is definitely not across the board, but this is typically, indoor strains will test higher. They'll get close, in the 20s, closer to 30% even, and more outdoor grown strains are testing a little bit lower. And so, when you actually consume those two different flowers, one next to the other, what I have experienced typically is that a lot of indoor cannabis has a very, very kind of surface high. It hits you really quickly, but then there's nothing beneath it. You don't stay high or stoned. You don't feel the effects that long. It's very kind of surface level. And then when you consume really well-grown, crafted outdoor cannabis, the complexity of all of the various cannabinoids and terpenes in there really give you a much more enhanced experience. So, our Maui OG tests at about 14% consistently year after year, and yet it is the OG bud buyers in San Francisco area absolute favorite strain. There are two dispensaries, which I will not name, who only buy our Maui OG, and when we are out of it, they do not have us on the shelf. Like, it is their cult favorite. But it takes a particular dispensary to have that kind of level of understanding and be comfortable to be able to say and explain to consumers, look, this is why. It takes more effort and takes more knowledge, but, we need to get there. I think part of it is the full spectrum sunlight that develops a better cannabinoid profile. And then I think it's the soil. When you're growing in live soil and you're using organic nutrients and fish teas and whatnot, it really is developing those terpene profiles. We see about 2% on average in our product, and that's significantly beyond what you typically see in indoor.
I can totally see where that'd be. I mean, when you think about it, there's nothing like the sun. Even when they talk about indoor growing, that they think it has the full spectrum of the sun, we don't know that. And also, I mean, there's terroir to take into consideration. A few episodes ago, I think it's episode 4, I had Phil Couturi on, who is he's like one of the pioneers of organic grape growing, and he's grown cannabis for years and was talking about, grapes, flowers. It's like, being outdoors, having like a little bit of the stress and struggle actually makes for a richer plant. What are your thoughts around terroir?
It's interesting. We'll see. There's also the appellation conversation going on as well. I would say that in terms of our climate and the soil that we grow in, there's a huge difference when you look at Lake County cannabis versus Mendocino cannabis versus Humboldt cannabis. There's something to be said there. There is something in the soil. There's something that is definitely affecting the structure of the bud, the flavor profiles, the scent profiles. We are actually working on an experiment right now. We are planting some non-cannabis terpene plants with some of our cannabis plants and seeing what kind of effect that takes. But, I think we're going to learn more again as testing continues. We're only 1 year into the legal cannabis market, or 1.5 years into the legal cannabis market in California. And so there isn't that much data from all of the test results yet. It was a rocky start with testing. Testing was all across the board. Now it's stabilized a little bit. And I think as we continue to see that roll out and start to get more and more of that information, we will be able to identify, is there something special that you're getting in your product from the soil, from this climate, from this region, from this watershed? Someone recently said to me, it's interesting, our outdoor bud structure is very dense. And you usually only see that in indoor. Typically outdoor is a little bit larfier and a little bit fluffier. Mm-hmm. And somebody said to me, he's a salesperson in the cannabis ancillary market, and said that I always see dense buds in Lake County. They always have dense buds coming out of Lake County. Is that how your product is? And it was the first time somebody kind of connected the dots, because we live in a very kind of isolated world in some ways in this cannabis. As much as we're talking to other cultivators, we're not comparing that many notes. But I think there's something to be said for the sun and the soil and all of that truly contributing to the taste and the flavor and the complexity.
Yeah, I agree. I remember when I first started working with cannabis, and it was funny because we'd almost poo-poo outdoor. We'd always say that it was weaker, and people were more into the aesthetics of indoor. And then you have a really well done outdoor flower, and it blows you away. There's
right,
nothing quite
exactly.
like it. Yeah,
exactly.
Love that.
Exactly.
How long has Aster Farms been going, and how did that come to be?
Yeah. So my husband is my co-founder. And his grandparents actually moved to Mendocino 50 years ago, and his family has been growing sustainable cannabis off the grid for about 50 years now. In fact, his grandfather was the first person who went to prison for cannabis cultivation in Mendocino. And legend has it, his family and the local neighboring farms brought indica to California. But that one we're still vetting that legend.
That's an awesome one to have, though.
In the family. Yeah, it is. It is. We're vetting it, though. We're trying to connect with the other people on Signal Ridge and see what the deal really is. But so cannabis was in Sam's family, and I had actually been in the, I was a buyer for Bloomingdale's, and then, ran a tech company. And at that point, I was really burnt out. I didn't want to be in the technology space anymore. I had this just desire to literally stick my hands in the soil. And at the same time, cannabis had really taken that turn for me and turned into a medicinal and wellness product, and something that was becoming a much more important part of my life. So the combination of all those things kind of came together. And so we started spending more time out in Northern California learning about the family farm and organic practices and all of that. And what we realized on the market was that there was a hole. There wasn't really a brand that was healthy but not necessarily hippie. And that's kind of who we are as people. We're conscious consumers. We care about what we put in our bodies. We care about where we spend our money. But at the same time, we're not necessarily super hippie. And so we wanted to see a brand that spoke to us and had all of those same ethos, and had a very contemporary brand to it. So we decided, all arrows are pointing in this direction. Let's just do this. So we partnered up with Sam's closest family friend, since he was a child, who had been growing organic cannabis in Lake County for about 15 years. And so he is our director of cultivation. He is the actual grower. And so he has been growing on his own property for about 10 years, and that is the same exact soil that we grow in today. So that is kind of how Aster came together. And like I said, we launched in stores in about the summer of 2018, right when the legal market turned on here in California.
Okay. Well, that's a really interesting time to jump into all of this, that's for sure. Oh. It was a good time to jump in because we went about this intending from day one to be
fully buttoned up, following all regulations. And so when all the regulations switched on, there were actually not that many brands who had all compliant packaging, passed all of the testing. So it was actually a great time. There was a little hole in the market to kind of squeeze in. So it was good timing.
Well, and especially too, I think, for a sustainable cannabis product, because we were seeing a lot of people getting into I usually talk about more the industry, the movement, but really the cannabis game, and we were missing out on like a lot of the quality products that we used to have back in the 215 days, when when whoever brought the flowers in was actually the person who grew it. Yeah. And that kind of like circles back to sustainability. So I know some of our listeners will understand exactly what that means. But for people who are trying to educate themselves on what sustainable cannabis is and why that's a good thing, would you want to elaborate on that?
Absolutely. So sustainability means a lot of things and can be defined many ways. For us, it's really about not taking from the earth, what we're putting back into it, and really being environmentally conscious, and not just in terms of how we're treating the actual land and environment where our farm is, but also in terms of our carbon emissions, and really living and operating in the lightest carbon footprint possible, and leaving our land better than it was today for the future generations. So for us, that means sourcing as much as we can. Anything that we can't actually produce on the farm, we try to source within a 50-mile radius of the farm, so that we're buying local, and the actual transportation involved is not causing a huge carbon footprint. In addition to that, sustainability when it comes to actual agriculture, you're typically talking about regenerative farming. And what regenerative farming means is really focusing on live soil and not depleting the soil of all of its nutrients. So with regenerative farming, if you ever drive by big ag fields and they're just big brown dirt fields, that is the opposite of regenerative sustainable farming. What's happening there is that you have a dead layer of topsoil. And what we do at our farm, and what people do with regenerative farming, is you actually grow crops in the off season. So you always have a green layer of vegetation on top of that soil. And what that's doing is it's pulling nitrogen and other nutrients into the soil. The roots of those cover crop are digging deep down and aerating the soil and creating, the right fluffiness that we need to plant our plants in. It's also holding on. Those roots and the vegetation is actually holding on to that top layer of soil so that it can't flow away in a storm or in a rain into the waterbeds. And so there are many, many reasons why it's super important to really be nurturing and paying attention to your soil, to be growing cover crop and not depleting it of the nutrients. Because cannabis, all plants, if you grow a mono plant, a single crop plant on your farm, you're depleting certain nutrients. So it's super important to be focusing on what you're putting right back into your land, and that what you're putting back in is all natural, all organic, and best would be native to your region. So those are some of the ways that we really focus on sustainability. One of the trickiest parts of being a sustainable brand in cannabis is the packaging. And that's because in California, cannabis packaging is required to be child resistant certified, and that certification process is very difficult. So there aren't that many biodegradable or recyclable materials that have been certified into those forms as child resistant. So that's definitely the area that there's the most work to be done, both in this industry and for us as a brand.
Yeah, I think that's a huge challenge, and also as Californians, because we've always led the charge around, recycling, composting, that's spread across the nation, and to see all the waste that we have right now is really sad.
Yeah, I mean, even, our eighths are sold in glass jars with a plastic top. Both pieces can technically be recycled. However, recycling plants are allowed to reject and throw into the landfill anything that has touched cannabis because it is deemed an illegal substance. So if you're listening to this and you're going to recycle your jar from some cannabis, definitely rinse it off so that there isn't any residue in there, in the hopes that it makes it through the recycling process.
That is a great tip. I know we, at the dispensary where I'm public education officer at the Apothecarium, we have a lot of people who come up to us with their jars later on saying, what do I do with these? And we always tell them to put them in the recycling. Although I have noticed a few people who have said that they've used them for regifting, or they use them for their spice cabinet. So there's some creative uses.
That's great. Totally. We've also seen, I know Flocana does a lot of activations where they plant succulents and things into old jars. So there are lots of crafty ways to use old jars.
That's very cool. Yeah, the other day,
not necessarily Mylar, not Mylar bags, though. Not many uses for those.
No, that's true. I have noticed, though, that some companies are starting to replace those Mylar zips with biodegradable plastic, which is really nice to see. I know it's not as cost effective, but in the long run, I think it really behooves us to do things like that.
I agree. The one thing that is tricky, though, is from what we found, all of the biodegradable bags on the market, it actually turns into a form of acid when it biodegrades.
Oh.
So, yeah, exactly. So it's a plus on one side and a big negative on the other.
What have you heard about the possibility of hemp-based products for containers?
I haven't heard much about that. I know that there are a lot of companies that create biodegradable products, other products out there that are realizing that the cannabis industry needs this. We're talking to one group in Santa Rosa right now who's working to get child-resistant certification. But so far, all the materials that we've come across have not included hemp. But honestly, it's, to be able to go full circle, hemp is an incredibly incredible crop in terms of carbon sequestration. So is cannabis, but hemp is grown in a larger scale, and so it does that much more carbon sequestration. So to really kind of close that loop on the sustainability, it would be amazing if somebody created a hemp material in CR.
Yeah. I think that there's just so much opportunity. We're going through our growing pains, especially here in California, but I think that there's an enormous opportunity with the industry to be able to create a whole new blueprint as to how we do business around sustainability, around, abundance, around social justice. There are just so many things that come into play that we have a unique opportunity to start early on instead of having to do late stage storming, norming, and reforming.
Exactly. And I think this industry also has the opportunity to kind of lead change, really lead and be at the forefront of change, both in terms of the sustainability movement, when you talk about big ag and how agriculture has to make a shift at some point, and in terms of social justice. This industry really kind of represents and epitomizes a lot of the things that have really gone wrong in this country. And we are having a fresh start, which doesn't exist in any other industry. Not a fresh start, but we have an opportunity now to kind of kick it off in a whole new way. And so I think it is the responsibility of legal operators in this industry to be socially and environmentally conscious.
Yeah, I agree. And empowering for consumers, because we do so many, I really believe that if we have more in-depth education programs, not just at the dispensary level, that will the more informed the consumers are, the safer they are. And that's, 'cause
absolutely,
everybody's so different, And I was going to I wanted to circle back too with your experience at Bloomingdale's, because with this new market and with normalization, and we can have retail and we can have heart too. It's entirely possible. And I'm just wondering, like, with with that background experience, like when I first started working in a dispensary, most of the people there, some of them had retail experience, but everybody was just a total geek about cannabis in general. And it was a really quirky bunch because this was a while ago. But it's like now we have more people who are excited about getting engaged with the industry. And I know, more people that have been involved in like hospitality and retail are getting involved, which I think is a really good thing, especially with communication. But for you, with your background in retail, how do you think that informed your moves, and how do you think that it enriched your experience working with cannabis?
That's a great question. I think some of the areas that I've really taken from my experience as a buyer and brought to this really revolve around pricing. In a new industry, we all kind of created our pricing in July of 2018 when everybody came legal onto this market, and there were actually brands for the first time, in the way that there are now. And, one of the easy things to do is be really volatile with your pricing and change it according to the whims and the ups and downs of the supply chain and of the market dynamics. And one of the things that I learned being in the retail apparel industry as a buyer is that price fluctuation does not help anyone. It is better if you stick to your guns on the price that your product is worth and valued. And that means in bad times, it might be a little bit tougher to sell. In good times, you might have the oyster is your world, or the world is your oyster. And I think that's been important for us. And I think it has shown, at least to many of our retailers, that we understand that stability is important, and to be able to know what you're getting out of a brand when we show up with our menu every week is important. So I think that's one area. I also was a buyer during the recession. And so I think there are going to be a lot of parallels as we see, how the economy unfolds over the next 6 months to a year. But market dynamics shift dramatically when, there's an economic downturn. And so I think it's going to be interesting to bring some of my insight from that time to this. But even beyond that, it's funny because there is a lot of data to some extent, but then when I think back to my days as a buyer at Bloomingdale's, I just spent all my time on Excel. And we're just scratching the surface with even, understanding, projecting and understanding like how rolling out new SKUs and all of that in terms of, an actual retail model. It's kind of just like throwing darts right now. So I think it's gonna mirror those more traditional retail worlds more and more. I mean, already you're starting to see slotting programs like marketing where a brand pays to be on a top shelf in a store. You're starting to see shop in shops, which is where a brand kind of takes over a part of a store and they actually build out the physical infrastructure to be branded as them. So you're starting to see some of those games that the traditional retail industry already plays. So I think it's going to be interesting, and it's going to be fun for somebody like me to kind of watch as it begins to get more and more aligned with traditional retail.
Yeah. I think it's fascinating to see, and I'm hoping with that normalization that we'll start getting some more breaks as well, because especially after legalization, a lot of people were really upset about how expensive everything became, not realizing that we're dealing with sales tax, excise tax, and in certain municipalities, an additional cannabis tax on top of it. And I think that's where normalization becomes a call to action for consumers, because when people get really upset about that, I always mention to them, well, what you have to understand is that these are people in our government that are making these decisions around where these taxes are going to go and which taxes are going to exist. And as a consumer and as a voter, what we need to do is to start seeing these politicians and officials, having them see us as not only are we active in society, but we're productive and we use cannabis and we vote. Because I think that'll, we really need to make some changes so that it's more accessible, and also just where we're divvying out these taxes to, because a lot of it didn't seem to really make a whole lot of sense. For me personally, the passing of 64 I felt like it was a step that we had to make to evolve the industry, but I also knew that it wasn't going to be pretty because we were having to work with people that may not necessarily have been so keen on it happening.
Absolutely. I would agree with you on that. I think, in California, just in the last 6 months, they actually increased the cultivation tax and the excise taxes. And we don't necessarily get to have a say in where that money is going. We're in Lake County, where our farm is. We're part of Lake County Growers Association, which has formed a group that attends all the Board of Supervisors meetings and gives public comment and whatnot. But even that's not enough. And I think I agree with you. There are some cannabis companies out there, and we'll definitely be doing this as well as it gets closer to election time, that are actually doing a lot of great research for people and putting out lists of people at the local level that you can vote for who are going to actually be aligned with the way that we see the cannabis industry and the changes that we know need to be made.
Yeah, there's a lot of education that needs to be done on that side. I'm actually on the oversight committee for San Francisco, and when the controller's office put out a report, they were talking about how the price per gram had gone up in dispensaries, and they had mentioned that they thought it was due to competition. And that's when I stopped them and I said, nobody's ever done that. Nobody's ever said, I'm competing with you, let's raise the price. And it's like, let's break this down. Let's look at what the real price is, and then let's look at how many times excise tax hits it, and then we have sales tax, and we have everything else. Really, this is all about taxation. This has nothing. Actually, this is hurting businesses, and it was amazing. It's just like when you tell people, and this is no news to you, that the green rush is over. People don't understand that it's a business now.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, and it's a business with very, very, very tough margins right now. Even for equity dispensaries where they don't have to pay the excise, where they have the excise tax weighed, that doesn't trickle all the way down the supply chain. As a cultivator, you're taxed for your canopy locally, and then you're taxed again on the state level for your cultivation tax. So even if you are getting a break as an equity dispensary on the excise tax, you're still getting squeezed because everything you're buying is being bubbled up from all these additional taxes. So the actual product you're purchasing has already been marked up to include all of these ridiculous. I mean, they're not ridiculous taxes, but these excessive taxes. We hope that the tax dollars that we're paying are really going to, make change in our communities. But until we actually see that, it's pretty tough to swallow.
It is. Well, and then taking into consideration the fact that prior to COVID, we were looking at major extinction events in the industry. And now it's even harder. So we have COVID that's affecting our industry and our ability to be sustainable. Luckily, we've been considered necessary in these times, but I think that should also garner further consideration with how we're taxed. And then we have what's going to be happening possibly in August if no aid is approved, where we're going to have a lot of people who are going to be scrambling for cash and still needing help. And especially with COVID and everything that's been going on, especially with the unrest because of how people have been treated unfairly in Black Lives Matter, we have a lot of PTSD, we have a lot of sleeplessness, we have a lot of stress. So more than ever, people are using cannabis for homeostasis, and how are they going to be able to afford it with everything that's going on? And then how do we sustain as a community and an industry? It's quite a ball of wax.
Yeah, absolutely. And then on top of everything, in California, at least, we recently had a string of organized crime burglaries that went through that hit a bunch of the cannabis industry. And that includes some equity dispensaries. And, when you're hit in a burglary, you lose your cash because, again, this is a federally illegal substance, so we cannot bank properly. You lose your cash, you lose all of your product, you have, damage done to your property. How do you keep going after that? it's a tough time, and we're having very, hard and sensitive conversations with some of our retailers who are going through a tough time because of the limit to the number of people who can even walk their door, or, unfortunate events that have happened to their location. So I think, like you said, this was a year of extinction events, and I think it's only going to be worse. So it's going to be a tough year to weather through, and hopefully it's only this year.
Yeah, I hope so too. I really do. And I feel for everybody who's going through it. And in particular, I really feel for the equity operators, especially the ones who, were broken into, and it's really hard to recoup the costs. But I also really applaud a lot of the community, how they've come together to help out too, because there are some really great people that we're honored to work with that really dig in and do the work.
I would completely agree with you. And I think, with everything going on right now, I think a lot more attention is going to be highlighting some of those organizations who are doing the good work and getting more people behind them to support them. So that's my hope, at least.
Yeah. Yeah. And as far as as we kind of talk in the future, post-COVID, and hopefully in a much more equitable and loving world, what do you see in the future of what you want to see in cannabis, and what you want to work in with cannabis projects that maybe Aster Farms is looking at?
Yeah, I think right now it's going to be an interesting year also in terms of brand building. Up until this year, yes, there have been some brands on the market that are recognizable, but it's really been the last couple of years that brands are starting to form and create and garner loyalty. And so I think it's going to be a very interesting next 2 years as this industry matures and we start to see who is who and what do you stand for? Are you a brand that's just white labeling and you don't care who you're sourcing from and you don't have much of a story? Is there substance? I think we're really going to start to see who's who has substance, and also start to see, who cares about what. CanEclusive has put together an incredible accountability list to really look into whether or not cannabis companies are putting their money where their mouth is. It's easy to post a black square and say that you're in solidarity, but what do you do next? And so I think it's going to be an interesting year where, cannabis brands at least, and probably dispensaries as well, are going to be, building their brand in a totally new way, and really putting out there who they stand for and who they stand as. So we're pretty excited about that. And I also think it's going to be an interesting year or two in terms of regulations. Being deemed essential during COVID is definitely a new precedent has been set for cannabis. And I think it's definitely going to move the national conversation along substantially. Additionally, the Safe Banking Act has been slipped into the HEROES Act for the next COVID bill. So it didn't work out the last time, but hopefully we'll be able to get some pieces of the Safe Banking Act passed in the next couple months, which would be just a huge win for the cannabis industry. So, we're looking towards some new legalization happening on the federal level. We're looking towards brands really becoming and blossoming and turning into who they really are. And I think, what we hope to see, at least in California, I don't know the other markets as well, is for it to be a more equitable space. We know that in Los Angeles area, a lot of equity applicants were kind of told where their dispensary was going to be, and now they're being given the option to choose their location. And that's it sounds so simple, but that's a huge deal.
Oh, totally.
Where your dispensary is a make it or break it. And that's just another one of those stupid, unfair things that was thrown into the mix to make it even, not intentionally to make it difficult for equity applicants, but that does make it difficult. So I hope that the industry, and I think at least in California, the regulatory agencies have been listening, and I think that they are trying to make changes. And so I hope we see a more equitable industry in the next 2 years or so as the legislators are really reflecting on what this last year and a half, 2 years has been.
And I think as we've seen with the equity programs and equity applicants, I think we're starting to see some of the pitfalls, some of the loopholes that people have used to actually take advantage of equity applicants, and we're going to really change that too, because that's some really, I'm just going to be honest, it's some really messed up stuff. Because that's, we're taking advantage of a program that was here to help people because of the great disadvantages of opportunity in our industry.
Exactly.
So I'm going to go back into the flowers with you, but what do you, because I love nerding out on that. So Aster Farms, do you do your own genetics often, and how do you feel about legacy cultivars? Because we were talking about, what were we talking about, white rhino, or were we talking about white buffalo? White buffalo, right?
White buffalo.
That's right.
Yep.
I also like white rhino. That's a really good one too.
Yeah, so we have some proprietary genetics that we continue to breed. At the same time, we're still open and exploring. So we work with a handful of nurseries. We specifically try to buy from nurseries that are more local and smaller, because we don't want to have the same cultivars as everybody else on the market. We do want to have that uniqueness. And so when we do find a new strain that does check well with who our brand is and with our consumer, we do consider breeding it and keeping it. We are not crossing any strains at the moment ourselves. All the breeding we're doing is really just perpetuating those genetics. But it's something that we may get into in the future. But right now, we do grow from seed for the most part. We buy some clones, but we grow from seed for the most part, which definitely gives a more vigorous plant, but also lends itself to a lot more variation amongst the plants in each strain. So we'll see if we continue to go that route as the industry matures. But that's really how we focus on our strains. We're trying to find strains that are a little bit more unique, that are a little bit more landrace, but at the same time, it's tricky, and it's especially tricky now that the market is very locked in. Some nurseries haven't made it through the legal market, and so the pool of genetics that you have access to is pretty limited.
Yeah, that is true. That's another thing that I hope is that it becomes just in general easier for people to be able to cultivate in this market, because we've lost a lot of great genetics as a result of that.
Yes, absolutely.
So the nerdy side of me is curious, when you're planting, when your fields of green or fallow, what are you planting to regenerate the soil?
Yeah, so we actually plant amongst our plants both during the season and in the off season. So during the season, we typically have a bunch of wildflowers, some rye, and some peas. So those are planted in and amongst the full-term plants. And then in the off season, we're planting daikon and mustard seed for the most part. They both have really deep, aggressive roots. So they're great because we grow in live soil, like in the ground. They can just keep growing and growing and growing and breaking up our soil. And then we disc those right back into the soil to trap the nutrients in. So that's the majority. That's what we try to focus on in terms of the plants that we're planting in the off season in our cover crop.
Oh, that's so cool. And I think, correct me if I'm wrong, but I think mustard is one of the popular crops that wine growers use as well, correct?
It is. So if you drive down 101 it's typically like February-ish, you will see all of these kind of long, stringy flowers or plants with yellow flowers on top. Those are the mustard seed plants. They are all over all over the side of 101 and all the vineyards, all the other ag fields. It's really beautiful.
I love that field of yellow. It's just just going into wine country is magical, but as is going into cannabis country for that matter.
Yep. Absolutely. The interesting thing though, we've been growing more autoflowers, which are ruderalis. And because they only grow to be a couple feet high, they're not as hardy. And so they can't really compete with other crops in the ground too close to them. So our daikon has been really taken off a little bit too late in the season, and we have unfortunately had to weed our daikon out of our auto fields. So that was a little bit of a bummer in terms of our cover crop, but we've been making some great pickled daikon out of it.
Oh, that's cool. That's so interesting. And actually, for our listeners, can you explain like why you would choose an auto flowering plant?
Totally. So you probably heard there's sativa and indica. There is a third type of cannabis that is called ruderalis. And ruderalis typically has not had high THC, but in the last few years, people have been breeding it and crossing it with sativas and indicas to really up the THC level. What the difference is between a sativa and an indica plant and a ruderalis plant is that your typical cannabis, your sativa or indica, is light sensitive. So you plant it in the ground sometime in May or June, and in August, the light cycle shortens to 12 hours or less in a day. And when that happens, that light cycle, that short light cycle, triggers the plant and says, okay, it's about to be fall. I'm going to die soon. Time to propagate. I must start flowering to attract the males and the pollen. And so that's how your normal cannabis plant works. It's reliant on the sun. How an autoflower or ruderalis works is that it's not dependent on the sun. It basically starts flowering after a certain point in its vegetation, purely based on where it is in its growth span, not related at all to the sunlight. So ruderalis plants typically only grow to be maybe 2, maybe 3 feet tall. You're only yielding about 2 ounces from them, and they typically cap off in THC at about 17 or 18%. The reason that we are growing autoflowers, in addition to our full-term flowers, is that they have a really short cycle. So you can grow them in about 70 to 80 days. And what that does for an outdoor grower like us is give us multiple harvests of outdoor flower in one season. Typically in 1 year, with full-term plants, you can only get one harvest because they are light dependent, and it takes that full seasonal shift of the actual sunlight and the environment. So autos, you can typically get more like 2, some people even get 3 or 4 flips in a year.
So I that is one too that not only benefits you, but for people who want to grow at home, especially when you're starting out, that's a really great way to experiment with it too. Wouldn't you agree?
Absolutely. They are, even though they seem like weaker, smaller plants, they're really hardy. I would definitely say if you're interested in experimenting, trying out your green thumb with your first cannabis plant, a ruderalis is absolutely the way to go. It's also the difference between having a 10-gallon, or maybe like a 5-gallon pot in your house versus a 100-gallon or 25-gallon pot in your house. Growing a real full-term plant is a large project physically.
Yeah. I just got some plants for the very first time. I have them on my patio. I thought about it in the past. I actually had friends who had grown on my property, but I hadn't done it myself. And I just have 2 little girls and a boy together, and everyone keeps asking me, are you going to separate them? And I'm like, no, this is purely for juicing and to see seeds grow. I just want to see the process.
Oh, cool. Nice. Well, watching 2 plants breed, watching the seeds grow is a really fascinating process. The first time I saw a branch, and this is actually my co-founder and husband is going to kill me for telling this story publicly. Our team was breeding. A couple of years ago, our team was breeding, and we were in the field, and we came across this one branch. And we're like, oh my God, what is going on with this branch? Could this branch be infected? Is something wrong with it? We cut it off. We brought it to the cultivation team, and they were like, are you kidding? we were literally breeding that plant. That is the beginning of that flower creating seeds. So that was a bummer. Definitely learned my lesson. But yeah, it is fascinating to watch seeds start to produce on a flower.
Oh yeah, well, and my cat loves them. He goes out and it's actually the catio because it's all closed off, so we keep the door open a little bit for him, and he goes out and he chirps at them every morning. I think they commune together.
That's great. That's awesome.
Oh, Julia, this was so much fun. I'm so glad you came on today.
Yeah, agreed. This has been a great conversation.
So if people want to follow you on social media, what's the best way to do that?
You should check us out at Aster Farms. That's our handle on Instagram, which is where we are most active. And if you want to get in touch with us, you can always DM us there or email us at info@asterfarms.com.
And on your website, do you have the dispensaries that you're carried at?
We do. We try to update it pretty regularly. Sometimes it's not totally updated, but yes, it is a good list to work from. And we're actually going to be launching pretty soon a platform on our site where you can actually click right into delivery services that have us in your neighborhood and to order. So stay tuned for that.
That's cool, especially right now when everybody's kind of hunkering down at home. It's nice to be able to have those options. Well,
exactly.
Julia Jacobson, CEO of Aster Farms, thank you so much for being on today. And if you ever want to come back and there's something else you want to talk about, you're always welcome on Planted.
Thank you so much.
Yeah, you're so welcome. And send your husband my best. And thank you so much for sharing everything. I'm so excited about what you do. And this is an example of what we need to be seeing available. Everyone, thank you for tuning in today. If you want to follow Planted on social media, it's Planted with Sara on Instagram, Facebook, and also Twitter. Tune in with us next month. We're going to have another great interview. And stay safe, smoke safe, or imbibe safe, and be kind. Take care.